La invasión de Ucrania ha cambiado el mundo. Ha desestabilizado un continente, pero también ha reforzado la unidad de los países occidentales. Todo indica que acaba de empezar una nueva guerra fría. En el mundo de hoy, todo está conectado. A la agresión rusa en Ucrania se suma la lucha por el dominio en el continente asiático, una pugna de evolución imprevisible, y una de las claves de esa pugna está en la India. La nación está ante un dilema geopolítico. Rusia, un país amigo que le suministra armas, ha estrechado lazos con China, supeditándose a una potencia que no es precisamente uno de los mejores amigos de la India.
There are serious concerns in New Delhi about whether Russia will continue to be a reliable supplier.
Al mismo tiempo, cada vez es más evidente la amenaza que China supone para la India. Un país que refuerza sus fronteras ante los intentos de tomar su territorio.
The Chinese are breathing down our borders and they've just killed our soldiers less than 2 years ago.
Pero en la India también se plantea otro dilema. ¿Hasta qué punto debe acercarse a Occidente?
The US has had many alliances. Not all of them have fared very well.
La India tiene una larga tradición a la hora de evitar las alianzas demasiado estrechas. Tradicionalmente ha preferido no alinearse, pero ahora la guerra obliga a este país a reconsiderar todas sus relaciones y a elegir opciones que antes no había considerado. En la primera parte de este video analizaremos lo duradera que puede ser la vieja amistad entre Rusia y la India y si puede sobrevivir al camino emprendido ahora por Moscú.
The Russia relationship is now in a position where it really does need to be rethought.
En la segunda parte de este video veremos qué tensiones entre China y la India son más peligrosas de lo que el resto del mundo percibe. Piensen que Pekín aspira a controlar todo un estado indio. Tras la invasión rusa de Ucrania, es fácil imaginar allí otra guerra devastadora.
We are talking about a very big section of the world, a very important part of the world, a very large armies, nuclear-armed countries fighting each other.
En la tercera parte nos preguntaremos si la India y Occidente podrían llegar a ser aliados o si evolucionan en direcciones opuestas.
When China attacked us, where was this degree of outrage from Europe or from other countries? Yes, there was a little bit of finger wagging and tongue clicking, but nothing in comparison to what we are seeing.
Europe has a legacy problem with India because of the experience of colonialism. I think countries have to be very mindful of what leverage they have to influence change.
India is coming to resemble Russia and China far more than it resembles Western democracies.
A medida que el mundo se adentra en una inquietante nueva era, la India podría ser una pieza clave. No importa dónde estemos, las decisiones que se toman en Nueva Delhi nos afectan a todos. Así que vamos a empezar esta historia estudiando una decisión que antes la India no quería tomar, una decisión sobre un amigo rebelde. En febrero de 2022, el Consejo de Seguridad de Naciones Unidas evalúa la invasión rusa de Ucrania. El embajador de la India ocupa el asiento no permanente de su país y pide un alto el fuego.
We urge that all efforts are made for the immediate cessation of violence and hostilities.
Los países occidentales condenan la invasión con su voto. Rusia hace uso de su poder de veto y la India se abstiene. ¿Qué posición asumía la India? ¿Buscaba satisfacer a China al no condenar la invasión? En realidad, más que una cuestión de principios, era una reacción pragmática para no enfadar a un valioso amigo. Solo 2 meses antes, en Nueva Delhi, Vladimir Putin efectuaba un peculiar viaje al extranjero y alababa a su anfitrión.
Относимся к Индии как к великой державе с дружественным нам народом и с замечательной прямой историей наших отношений.
La historia había comenzado al inicio de la Guerra Fría. Más tarde, en 1971, Indira Gandhi y Leonid Brezhnev, preocupados por las tensiones con China, firmaron el Tratado Indosoviético de Paz, Amistad y Cooperación. Y aunque la política india de no alineación impidió que aquel tratado fuera una alianza completa, el acuerdo sí contribuyó a sellar la posición de Moscú como primer proveedor de armas de la India, algo que este país tiene muy presente. Jay Panda es vicepresidente del Partido Nacionalista hindú Bharatiya Janata.
Russia or the former Soviet Union had stood by India when we needed defense capabilities to deal with these challenges of China and others. It was the Soviet Union and continuing into Russia that gave us equipment.
A finales de 2021, durante la visita de Putin a Nueva Delhi, las armas estaban muy presentes en la agenda.
Работаем в военно-технической области, причем так, как не работаем с одним нашим партнером.
Rusia suministra a la India equipos de alta tecnología como sus misiles de defensa aérea S-400. El acuerdo que lo hace posible es tan polémico que Estados Unidos ha llegado a amenazar a la India con imponerle sanciones por ello. No obstante, Nueva Delhi se aferra al pacto y responde que Occidente no igualaría a Rusia en el suministro de la tecnología militar que la India necesita.
We are still denied certain key defense technologies which are critical for our safety and for our security. And we have been getting them from Russia.
Moscú también ha llegado a acuerdos que permiten a los productores indios fabricar material como estos tanques rusos T-90. Otros proveedores se han mostrado reacios a permitir eso. Pero de esa forma, la India no solo obtiene los tanques, sino que también impulsa su propia industria defensiva, lo que es una de las prioridades estratégicas del país. Tras la invasión rusa de Ucrania, Occidente ha incrementado la presión para que la India rompa su alianza con Rusia. Cuando en abril de 2022 el primer ministro Narendra Modi recibía en Nueva Delhi a la máxima responsable de la Unión Europea, Ursula von der Leyen le habló de lo que vio durante su viaje a la zona en guerra y pidió a sus anfitriones que no miraran a otro lado.
I visited Bucha. I saw with my own eyes the bodies lined up on the ground. The outcome of the war will not only determine the future of Europe. For the Indo-Pacific region, it is as important as for Europe that borders are respected.
Pero también en la India, durante el diálogo de Raisina, la principal conferencia de seguridad del país, el ministro indio de Exteriores aseguró que los asiáticos no se dejarían sermonear.
We've been hearing for the last 2 months a lot of arguments from Europe, saying, there are things happening in Europe and Asia should worry about it because these could happen in Asia. Guess what? Things have been happening in Asia for the last 10 years. Now, Europe may not have looked at it. This could be a wake-up call for Europe, not just in Europe. It could be a wake-up call for Europe to also look at Asia.
Fue una reprimenda pública dirigida por el principal diplomático de la India a la figura más poderosa de la Unión Europea. El mensaje era inequívoco: no nos digan lo que debemos hacer. Muchos de los presentes en el diálogo de Raisina coincidieron en que tanto la indignación occidental por el comportamiento de Rusia en Ucrania, como los llamamientos para que la India reduzca sus importaciones de energía rusa, son exigencias huecas. Shamika Ravi trabaja como economista para un instituto indio de investigación.
We have just come out of poverty. We still have an absolute poverty of 5 to 6%. So for us to bear some of the costs that Europe expects us to bear, while at a time when very affluent European countries continue to depend on Russian oil, it just smacks of blatant hypocrisy.
The US and other Western countries, especially the US, have done exactly this same kind of operation in many countries. They have a track record of invading countries, sometimes with UN concurrence, but many times without UN concurrence. So we have to have norms that apply to all.
No obstante, la invasión rusa sí despierta recelos en la India, y eso se debe más a la dura realidad que a una cuestión de principios. Garima Mohan es experto en las relaciones de la India con la Unión Europea.
The India-Russia partnership is very one-note. It is mostly about military equipment and defense supplies. The way the war is unfolding in Ukraine right now, there are serious concerns in New Delhi about whether Russia will continue to be a reliable supplier in the long run.
A weakened Russia with a degraded military-industrial infrastructure is not going to be the major, reliable, efficient partner that we were counting upon. before the war.
Shashi Tharoor, ex subsecretario general de la ONU, es una figura destacada del opositor Partido del Congreso.
I think that the Russia relationship is now in a position where it really does need to be rethought. There's a historical factor, if you like, of a long series of IOUs to first the Soviet Union and then to some degree to the Russian Federation, particularly when it came to sensitive Indian issues like Kashmir and so on, where they supported India, often vetoing unfriendly positions taken by other members of the Security Council, including some of the Western powers. That has all changed. The Western countries have now, by and large, supported the Indian stand on Kashmir, and I don't think we will now need a Russian veto anymore to be able to keep some issues off the agenda that we don't like being discussed there. Second, there is a long sense of dependence on Russia, and again the Soviet Union before that, for military supplies and equipment. But that was already on the way down. If you look at a 5-year period in the first half of the last decade, I think we may have bought as much as 75% of our military supplies from Russia. If you look at the second 5-year period, it came down to about 45%. India has been diversifying its military supplies, going to America, to Israel, to France and other countries for major equipment.
Los estadounidenses están atentos para ver cómo la India responde al declive de la fortuna rusa. Lisa Curtis fue responsable del sur de Asia en el Consejo Nacional de Seguridad de Estados Unidos.
It's clear that Russia will simply not have the capability to be a reliable partner to India moving forward. I think India will naturally diversify its military imports away from Russia because it will have to. Russia will not be able to export the kind of items that India needs. But my hope is that India recognizes this and starts to take the steps that it needs to take to diversify away from Russia.
Solo unos pocos delegados rusos llegaron a Nueva Delhi para participar en los debates del diálogo de Raisina, pero logramos hablar con uno de ellos. Alexei Kuprianov trabaja como experto en la India para un centro moscovita de estudios respaldado por el Estado ruso. Él insiste en que los lazos de Rusia con la India aún tienen mucho potencial.
Our past relations were fantastic. Our future relations for us, we think, will be fantastic as well, because and Russia and India see the world as the same way. We are now cut off the Western markets, Western investments and Western technologies. So we do not have other choice as to turn to the East. India will be our main market for our technologies, for our products, for our fertilizers, for our grain.
Para Rusia, mirar hacia el este significa mirar hacia China, y efectivamente Vladimir Putin y Xi Jinping se reunieron en Pekín poco antes de la guerra. Allí sellaron una asociación que, según afirmaron, no tendría límites. Sin embargo, eso implica para Rusia el riesgo de quedar supeditada a una China mucho más poderosa. Moscú es consciente de ello, asegura Alexei Kuprianov, y esa es una de las razones por las que Rusia quiere mantener a la India en el juego.
I think our relations with China will be relations of good friends who are supporting each other in this very hard situation after the Ukrainian conflict, because China now is under pressure of the United States and we are under pressure as well. In fact, the United States just push us to China, maybe in some fields against our will. And we are trying to keep a distance between us and China because, I can repeat, we do not want to be Chinese junior partner.
Sin embargo, aunque no lo quieran, los rusos serán, sin duda, un socio menor de China. Algunos aseguran incluso que Rusia está destinada a convertirse en un Estado cliente.
Surely, the way things are going, whatever happens as this war unfolds, Russia is going to emerge weakened. Weakened by sanctions, weakened by the calamities of war, weakened by the damage to its industry and its manufacturing by the conflict. Will it end up becoming a vassal state of China, a China that is hostile to India? I think it looks very, very likely that a weakened Russia will have no choice, particularly if the war ends but the ostracism continues and the Western countries continue to treat Russia as a pariah, they will have no choice but to look for a patron, a supplier, a market, etc. in China. And they will turn there. And if they turn there, the price will have to be that they will have to pay more heed to China's strategic interests.
Eso es importante para la India. Una Rusia bajo el pulgar de China no solo es menos útil como amigo, además refuerza la mano del mayor enemigo de la India. En lo alto del Himalaya, cerca de la frontera con China, el líder de la India llega para concentrar a sus tropas. A mediados de 2020, choques violentos contra las fuerzas chinas en la remota y disputada zona fronteriza de Ladakh dejan 20 soldados muertos, generando angustia en toda la India. Narendra Modi debía hacer una demostración de fuerza y exigir la retirada de los soldados chinos. Pero lo cierto es que las ambiciones expansionistas de China no han terminado en absoluto. De hecho, China aún pretende arrebatar territorio a la India. Las tensiones en la frontera no son nuevas. En 1962 motivaron una guerra entre ambos países que se prolongó durante un mes. Ahora, las tensiones han vuelto.
India-China border dispute is the biggest land dispute in the world right now. The amount of territory that both countries believe belongs to them is more than anywhere else in the world.
Sushant Singh estuvo 2 décadas en el ejército indio. Ahora trabaja como analista militar para un grupo de investigación de Nueva Delhi. Explica lo ocurrido en la línea fronteriza de Ladakh, la frontera de facto en donde se produjeron los enfrentamientos de 2020.
The crisis first was visible to us in May 2020 when a large number of Chinese troops had entered various areas in Ladakh. At this moment, nearly 100,000 troops combined from both Indian and Chinese side are believed to be deployed additionally on the line of actual control. And if I were to show you on the map where these friction points were, from north to south, this is the red line depicts the line of actual control in Ladakh, and this is an official CIA map from 1962. And this is the area of Depsang where the Chinese troops have come in and blocked Indian patrols. This is the second flashpoint of Galwan, where 20 Indian soldiers died on June 15, 2020, along with 4 Chinese soldiers after there was a clash without weapons. And then there are two areas here where there's a crisis in Gogra and Hot Spring, where again the Chinese troops have come in and blocked Indian patrols.
La India ha reforzado sus tropas en su extremo este, en el estado de Arunachal Pradesh. Allí las ambiciones chinas van aún más allá. Arunachal Pradesh está en el extremo oriental del Himalaya, en la frontera con China, Myanmar y el pequeño estado de Bután. En el lenguaje de las disputas fronterizas se denomina el sector oriental. Lo esencial aquí es que China no solo se disputa los límites, también reclama todo el estado al que denomina el sur del Tíbet.
Eastern sector in certain sense is the most significant because it has the town of Tawang. Tawang was originally a Buddhist town, a part of Tibet. It has got a Tibetan monastery there, where one of the former Dalai Lamas were born. So Tawang remains historically, culturally, strategically very significant for China, which is in India's control.
Una disputa fronteriza puede parecer un tecnicismo, algo que deben resolver los burócratas encargados de examinar los mapas, pero piensen en lo que acabamos de escuchar, que para China esta región tenga una importancia histórica, cultural y estratégica recuerda a los argumentos utilizados por Vladimir Putin para justificar su invasión de Ucrania. Es inquietante.
It definitely remains conceivable that China could undertake a military operation that could occupy Arunachal Pradesh, particularly areas which it believes are sensitive to it for reasons because of its occupation of Tibet and the way it has dealt with the Dalai Lama. It could definitely do that.
La India refuerza sus tropas en Arunachal Pradesh ante una posible guerra con la superpotencia vecina.
So in our consciousness, China is a threat. We have nearly a 4,000 kilometer boundary with them. They keep disrespecting the boundary agreements that we have with them and are not willing to proceed on settling of any outstanding issues on that front.
A war between India and China would be a war between two nuclear powers, two of the biggest countries in Asia, where Indian army is nearly 1.3 million strong. whereas Chinese army is nearly 2 million strong. So we are talking about a very big section of the world, a very important part of the world, a very large armies, nuclear armed countries fighting each other.
Pero China tendría una ventaja significativa en cualquier conflicto.
It's a much bigger power. Chinese economy is 6 times India's size. Chinese defense spending is 4 times India's size. China definitely has more diplomatic power, more global power. It competes with the United States, whereas India does not compete. India may want to compete with China, but India is a much smaller power than China.
La presión de China no se percibe solo en su frontera con la India, sino en toda la región. Pekín ha entablado una estrecha relación con el otro vecino problemático de la India, con Pakistán. A través de su nueva ruta de la seda, China ha invertido en infraestructuras, incluso en un enorme puerto en el mar Arábigo. Es parte de una estrategia más amplia que lleva a la India a sentirse cada vez más cercana.
The Chinese also have had something called a string of pearls theory. So for many decades, they have been putting up bases, naval bases around India to surround India. The Chinese also have, as the whole world knows, engaged in something that is being called debt trap diplomacy. Recently, the Sri Lankan economy collapsed because China had extended large amounts of money to Sri Lanka, perhaps through means where they influenced the decision-making process there.
Los delegados occidentales presentes en el diálogo de Raisina también expresaron su enorme preocupación por las ambiciones de China, y no solo en el patio trasero de la India, sino en toda la región del Indo-Pacífico. Eso incluye un reciente acuerdo de seguridad firmado con las Islas Salomón, un remoto archipiélago del suroeste del Pacífico. El ex primer ministro australiano Tony Abbott es uno de los muchos que alertan de que China podría estar planeando instalar allí una base militar.
The Solomon Islands are very strategically significant. It's absolutely understandable that from China's purposes, they would want to secure a significant foothold, ultimately perhaps a major military base in the Solomon Islands. Likewise, as far as Australia is concerned, this is really a red line that shouldn't be crossed.
La alarma también ha sonado aquí en Alemania. Tobias Lindner es secretario de Estado de Relaciones Exteriores.
We are concerned about that agreement between the Solomon Islands and China, and I can assure you we will watch very carefully about what is China doing in its neighborhood and in the region.
La expansión de China en el Indo-Pacífico se ha convertido en el principal desafío estratégico de Estados Unidos.
China wants to become the hegemon in the region. It wants to displace U.S. power and influence in the region and basically dominate the economics, the political power. It would like to assert its authoritarian ideology throughout the region and basically be able to dictate the terms that the region operates under.
Es una visión compartida por muchos líderes indios.
I think their game plan, whether it is for containing India or their aggressive actions in the Indo-Pacific, have a much larger significance for the whole world. They are taking over countries' economies and their political decision-making powers.
Como hemos oído, China tiene planes ambiciosos fuera de su territorio. ¿Y qué hace la India al respecto? Día de la Independencia en Nueva Delhi, poco después de los choques de 2020. En su discurso para la ocasión, Narendra Modi ensalzó su respuesta a la incursión de China.
देश की संप्रभुता पर जिस किसी ने आंख उठाई, देश की सेना ने, हमारे वीर जवानों ने उसका उसी की भाषा में जवाब दिया.
TikTok se convirtió en una víctima colateral de los enfrentamientos. La prohibición de esta y de otras aplicaciones chinas en la India fue parte de las represalias. 2 años después, en marzo de 2022, el ministro chino de Exteriores realizaba una visita sorpresa a Delhi, en un aparente intento de normalizar las relaciones. Pero su homólogo indio hacía hincapié en que eso no ocurriría sin que China se alejase antes de la frontera.
If you ask me, is our relationship normal today? My answer to you is no, it is not. And it cannot be normal if the situation in the border areas is abnormal. And surely the presence of a large number of troops there in contravention of agreements is abnormality.
No obstante, el experto militar Sushant Singh considera que la India muestra poca determinación al abordar el asunto.
There's been no discussion in Parliament, no questions have been entertained in the Parliament, there have been no official briefings, and the domestic media coverage of the China border crisis is absolutely minimal. There's nothing which is seen on the China border crisis in India. So at one level, while we see this major crisis on the border, at another level, we see a desire to underplay the crisis, perhaps because there's a significant weakness that India has vis-a-vis China, and it's a recognition of that weakness, recognizing that weakness that India really does not want to push out.
Even after the guns have stopped firing, there is absolutely no willingness to talk to Parliament. There's been a couple of unilateral statements read on the floor of each house by the foreign and defense ministers, but no debate, no responses to questions by MPs. It's been quite disgraceful, actually.
Desde la oposición, Shashi Tharoor, del Partido del Congreso, considera que la India se queda de brazos cruzados mientras el comercio con China se dispara con un balance muy desigual.
The trade has gone up to almost $100 billion a year, most of which is in China's favor. It's about 80% Chinese exports to India. Now, in these circumstances, you could see that continue because it was in China's interest to continue it, but not when they're actually shooting and killing your people. That, to my mind, is where the line had to be drawn. Everyone has been prepared to give the government the benefit of the doubt because they keep on saying they're talking to the Chinese and the Chinese should push back, but the Chinese haven't moved back. And in these circumstances, are we going to continue to just sit around temporizing, or are we going to examine broader options?
Mientras Nueva Delhi prepara sus próximos movimientos, la nueva cercanía entre Moscú y Pekín incrementa la presión para que la India reconsidere sus posiciones actuales.
China will dictate the terms of the Russia-China relationship moving forward. So India really has very little to gain by trying to placate Russia. I think that's a miscalculation on India's part, because Russia, if things come to blows with the Chinese on the border, there's very little that Russia will be able and willing to do for India.
No hay duda de que la India necesita amigos poderosos para enfrentarse a China. Con una Rusia inestable, Occidente podría ser una buena opción, pero esa relación también es complicada. Ambas partes consideran que aún hay importantes cuestiones sin resolver. La Cancillería de Berlín en mayo de 2022. Narendra Modi llegó hasta aquí con algunos de los miembros más veteranos de su gabinete para una jornada de consultas con sus homólogos alemanes. El resultado, una larga lista de acuerdos bilaterales sobre desarrollo ecológico, comunicaciones seguras, migración y otros muchos asuntos. Fue solo el último torbellino de compromisos entre Occidente y la India. Modi también había hecho paradas en Francia y Dinamarca. Estados Unidos organizó además conversaciones entre los titulares de Exteriores y Defensa en Washington, citas a las que se sumaron las conversaciones durante el diálogo de Raisina con grandes delegaciones de muchos países occidentales. Joe Biden ha hecho hincapié en la importancia de los lazos entre la India y Estados Unidos.
The relationship between India and the United States, the largest democracies in the world, is destined to be stronger, closer, and tighter, and I think it can benefit the whole world.
No obstante, la asociación que más interés despierta es la Alianza Quad, que integra a 4 grandes democracias del Indo-Pacífico: Estados Unidos, la India, Japón y Australia.
The Quad is not a formal alliance, but it is potentially at least an extremely strong partnership. Because it does bring together the main Indo-Pacific democracies. India is a very, very natural partner for Australia.
La Alianza Quad cobró relevancia bajo la administración de Donald Trump para incrementar la presión de Estados Unidos sobre China. Lisa Curtis fue clave para ponerla en marcha.
India is a central pillar to the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy in terms of India's influence throughout the region, its economic, political, growing military influence in the region. The U.S. very much wants India to have those capabilities to assert more power and to become that net provider of security that the U.S. has envisioned. So that's why we see the U.S. Supporting India, building defense security ties, putting emphasis on the Quad. The Quad has taken off in the last couple of years.
Las cuatro potencias realizan regularmente ejercicios navales, como se ve en este video del ejército indio. Son pruebas diseñadas para impulsar la cooperación de las tropas y para dar a entender a Pekín que las rutas marítimas cruciales deben permanecer abiertas. Pero este cuarteto no es una agrupación militar, y el gobierno indio se muestra cauteloso a la hora de afirmar que su objetivo es contener a China.
The Quad is not intended to be threatening to China, but the Quad is intended to message that democracies have shared interests that you cannot have with non-democracies. And so we are working together to reassure and assure some of the fundamental principles of a democratic and open world, which is access to the sea lanes, respect for sovereignty, and all of that.
Algunos consideran que la alianza Quad debería ir más allá.
We had never allowed it to develop a security component, but maybe we need to rethink that, because maybe we will need such a mechanism, since the Chinese are breathing down our borders and they've just killed our soldiers less than 2 years ago. So, for example, do I see a problem with introducing a military dimension into the Quad? If the others are willing, I wouldn't have minded one. Would I want to see more than just information sharing with some of the Western countries, where there is indeed some cooperation, particularly in the counter-terrorism front already, intelligence sharing and so on? Would I be willing to see more than that in terms of military cooperation? My answer is yes.
Algunos han llegado a calificar al cuarteto de semilla de una OTAN asiática, de una alianza defensiva a gran escala. Pero para la India, eso implicaría romper su resistencia a las alianzas, y esa es una tradición muy arraigada en todo el espectro político del país.
Some people asked, is India's position one of strategic ambiguity? No, it is not. India is quite clear that we are not ambiguous. We will take steps primarily from national interest and in cooperation with other democracies. What the difference also means is this, that alliances in the West have had a mixed track record. In the Middle East, the US has had many alliances. Not all of them have fared very well.
Would I want India to publicly declare itself an ally of a country? I'm not even sure I'm ready to bite that bullet, because the word alliance implies to some degree a mortgaging of your freedom to make your own decisions. And we are a country that has been under 200 years of foreign rule, where a foreign country was making our security decisions and our geopolitical postures for us. Having won our sovereignty just 75 years ago, for us it's too precious to compromise and surrender. We want to be the ones deciding our own fate.
A pesar de ello, Lisa Curtis nos dijo que Estados Unidos estaría dispuesto a establecer una alianza con la India si las actitudes en Delhi cambiaran.
Well, I think the answer is yes. The U.S. would be very interested in having a very close partnership, even an alliance, if it were possible. But it's frankly not possible. India is not interested in having an alliance with any country.
Por ahora, asegura Jay Panda, lo que la India quiere es que Occidente se tome en serio el suministro de la tecnología defensiva que necesita y que también respalde el desarrollo de su propia industria militar.
We can't afford to just have a huge gap in our defense capabilities if those equipments are not available from Russia. Now, as I said, despite buying tens of billions of dollars worth of defense equipment from the US and other Western countries, we are still denied certain critical defense technology and equipment. That has to change. And India can't just remain the biggest acquirer of defense equipment. We have to start making it on our own. There must be co-production here. India can't be just a source to sell equipment to. The Indian domestic defense industry is growing in leaps and bounds under Prime Minister Modi. The West needs to participate in that.
Así que las potencias occidentales deben decidir cuánta tecnología militar están dispuestas a compartir con la India. Pero ese impulso de estrechar lazos va mucho más allá de la seguridad. En el diálogo de Raisina, mantenido en Delhi, la figura más poderosa de la Unión Europea saludó un nuevo compromiso en materia de tecnología y comercio y sugirió un objetivo aún mayor, un acuerdo de libre comercio.
I am very pleased that today Prime Minister Modi and I have agreed to establish an EU-India Trade and Technology Council to tackle key trade, economic and technological challenges. We have launched negotiations on a free trade agreement, as well as on investment protection and geographical indications. For Europe, this is a strategic investment in our partnership with India.
El mensaje de Ursula von der Leyen fue bien recibido por los delegados presentes en el diálogo de Raisina.
Exports have been a very fundamental part of our, the tech-driven, services-driven growth story of the last 30 years. So exports and imports, the trade is very, very important for us, and I cannot underscore enough the relevance of a lot of these trade agreements.
Pero sellar acuerdos de libre comercio es difícil. Tanto Estados Unidos como la India se encuentran fuera de la mayor zona de libre comercio del mundo, fuera de la Asociación Económica Integral Regional, que acaba de entrar en vigor en Asia. Eso ha hecho temer que se convierta en una zona dominada por China. Así que tanto Occidente como la India se ven presionados para mantener el ritmo.
Well, free trade agreements are notoriously complex to negotiate, but EU free trade agreements are even more difficult. I think what is more interesting is to see how India has changed its mind on FTAs. For the longest time, India was seen as very protectionist and very reluctant to do FTAs. And now it's in negotiating stages with Canada, with the United Kingdom, with a number of other partners, and with the EU.
We have a lot to learn from Europe and a lot to gain by strengthening this relationship. Not just again in terms of trade, but even in terms of regulations. For instance, the whole data protection laws, to a large extent we are motivated. We are quite inspired by the changes and reforms that Europe is bringing in because human rights are at the center of a lot of the reforms that are being brought in. And India, being a plural democracy, a liberal democracy, I think those are our aspirations as well. So moving forward, there is only one way we can really move, which is close up.
Se habla mucho de los valores comunes que supuestamente sustentan estos proyectos. Se repite que como democracias, la India y los países occidentales encajan de forma natural. ¿Pero existe una cercanía real entre estas naciones? Nueva Delhi en 2022. Las autoridades locales derriban propiedades de musulmanes. Deutsche Welle informa desde el lugar de los hechos.
Bulldozer is a term trending in India right now as a troubling wave of anti-Muslim violence hits the country. Authorities gave orders for bulldozers to demolish many structures here. These businesses that stood behind me were largely owned by Muslims, and videos even show officials ripping into the outer entrance to a mosque. Officials say these demolition drives targeted illegal buildings, but many Muslims here feel there is a pattern of them being targeted. Over the weekend, a throng of Hindu men in a religious procession passed through this predominantly Muslim neighborhood. Communal riots broke out, leaving several injured. Similar clashes erupted in several states.
El partido Bharatiya Janata del primer ministro Narendra Modi ha sido responsabilizado de azuzar el odio contra los musulmanes como parte de un programa nacionalista hindú. Hace 2 décadas, en 2002, unas 2.000 personas, la mayoría de ellas musulmanas, fueron asesinadas en disturbios surgidos en Gujarat, el estado natal de Modi. Narendra Modi era entonces jefe de gobierno de ese estado y fue responsabilizado no solo de no haber detenido la violencia, sino incluso de haberla aprobado. Eso lastró sus relaciones con Estados Unidos. En 2005, las autoridades estadounidenses le negaron el visado por graves violaciones de las libertades religiosas. Desde que en 2014 tomó posesión del cargo de primer ministro, el gobierno de Narendra Modi ha impulsado una serie de medidas antimusulmanas, especialmente desde el comienzo de su segundo mandato en 2019. En agosto de ese año, el gobierno despojó a Cachemira, el único estado del país de mayoría musulmana, del estatus especial de semiautonomía que le otorgaba la Constitución. Se le impuso un bloqueo draconiano con cortes en las conexiones de Internet, detenciones de altos cargos políticos locales y severas restricciones al acceso de los medios de comunicación. Luego, en diciembre de 2019, una nueva ley de enmienda ciudadana determinó cómo los migrantes de los países de la región podían convertirse en ciudadanos indios. Ofrecía una vía rápida a los hindúes y a otros grupos religiosos, pero no a los musulmanes. Las Naciones Unidas calificaron la ley de discriminatoria. Las protestas en su contra generaron grandes disturbios en Nueva Delhi. Más de 50 personas murieron y la policía fue acusada de ayudar a las turbas hindúes a atacar a los musulmanes. El periodista Hartosh Singh Bal es editor político de la publicación de Caravan, una revista crítica con el partido Bharatiya Janata del primer ministro Narendra Modi. A él también le preocupan los constantes ataques contra los musulmanes.
The slow burn of violence directed against Muslims. Muslims getting lynched in trains, in streets, attacked merely on the suspicion of maybe they are carrying beef, which is one way of identifying them as other. They eat beef, which Hindus are not supposed to. The constant hate that is fed through Facebook, WhatsApp, Twitter, that is part of this project. Clearly, in terms of public life, Muslims have never had it so bad as they have it today, and it is growing worse with each passing day.
Hartosh Singh Bal asegura que en la India los musulmanes están desapareciendo de la escena política.
Muslim representation in the legislatures across the country, not just in parliament but in state legislatures which govern the federal units of the Indian state, has fallen dramatically. It is probably at its lowest since 1947 today. So you don't have that presence in political power, and this is a minority that is 15% of the Indian population, 200 million people. It is larger than almost every country in Europe, just this minority.
Jay Panda es uno de los líderes más destacados del partido Bharatiya Janata. Él niega que su partido tenga un programa antimusulmán.
One of the arguments being made against BJP is that it is majoritarian. It is against the minorities. That's not the case. We have traditionally not received very many minority votes, but that is increasing every time. In the recent elections in UP, our vote share from Muslims grew by 2%. It's nearly double digits now. In Assam, we recently had urban elections in 80 towns, 80 municipalities. A dozen of them have dominant minority votes, which the BJP won, all of them. Now, these are facts that are often not presented to Western viewers because of certain vested interests. I urge your viewers and Western visitors to go deeper into the matter and understand this.
En las elecciones de 2022 en Uttar Pradesh, mencionadas por Jay Panda, el partido Bharatiya Janata reforzó aún más su poder en el estado más poblado de la India. Yogi Adityanath, un monje hindú considerado como un radical antimusulmán y un posible futuro líder del partido Bharatiya Janata, fue reelegido como jefe del gobierno regional. Las elecciones de Uttar Pradesh fueron el último desastre del Partido del Congreso, la principal formación opositora de la India. Al frente de la campaña estaba Priyanka Gandhi, de la dinastía política que ha dominado el partido desde la independencia del país. Shashi Tharoor, figura destacada de esta formación, admite que el partido está al borde del abismo. Muchas voces piden que se separe de la familia Gandhi.
Well, I think that there is a widespread perception that the party needs change and overhaul. About the question of a particular set of leaders, the answer is that that will depend on what the party workers want. There is no question that the Congress has been suffering defeat after defeat in a number of situations for some time, and that some of us have rather openly within the party called for very specific steps to revive it. Many of us feel that this is really a last chance to get our act together with just 2 years to go for the next general election.
Algunos partidos regionales son actores importantes, como el AAP, dirigido por el ministro jefe de Delhi, Arvind Kejriwal, pero ninguno logra desafiar al Bharatiya Janata a nivel nacional. Modi es incontestable. Los críticos aseguran que el poder del Bharatiya Janata no es solo político. Dicen que está respaldado por enormes intereses empresariales, en una fusión de poder financiero e influencia mediática. La televisión es una de las principales fuentes de noticias para cientos de millones de indios y está controlada por un pequeño grupo de gigantescos consorcios afines al gobierno.
People are in the media not for the money they can make from the media, but basically for the influence peddling with the government that they can do. So you combine this model of large financial ownership. Such large financial ownership almost always in India has business interests spread across the economy. Most of those business interests are far larger than the media interest. In some ways, the media is then seen as a trade-off of influence to help your other businesses grow. That is what is driving media in India today. So these large owners, many of them the equivalent of what you would call oligarchs in the case of Russia, own media, they have close links to the government.
Algunos medios de comunicación no corporativos sobreviven, entre ellos la revista The Caravan de Hartosh Singhal, que recibe ingresos por suscripciones, pero al igual que otros medios pequeños, se enfrenta a un constante aluvión de amenazas legales.
All of us have, for various aspects of our reporting, faced police cases. There are sedition cases going on against our owners and my editor, Vinod. This is part of the game. Other organizations have similar sedition cases, cases for reporting what the government doesn't like. We have defamation cases going on against us by the son of the National Security Advisor, Ajit Doval. So things like this are par for the course. But do they impinge our day-to-day ability to do what we need to do? At the moment, no. And I think that is primarily because the government does not see us as real threats. We are pinpricks, and it can allow us to exist, in some ways even sell us as proofs of the fact that there is an independent media environment in this country.
El resto del mundo toma nota. En 2022, la India pasó del puesto 142 al 150 en el ranking de libertad de prensa elaborado por Reporteros Sin Fronteras. Hace 20 años, cuando el índice fue creado, el país ocupaba la posición número 80. Las dudas sobre el compromiso del gobierno indio con el pluralismo y la igualdad de derechos es lo que más preocupa en Occidente.
There is concern about the treatment of Muslim minority under the BJP government, particularly the second term, Modi's second term. We've seen some problematic developments with the Citizenship Amendment Act, which clearly discriminates against Muslims. So I would just call Indian leaders back to their own, founding documents and their own traditions of having, knowing that a strong democracy is represented by the protections that it provides to its minorities.
No obstante, Jay Panda insiste en que el partido Bharatiya Janata está comprometido con la igualdad.
Let me make it very clear. India's constitution is going to be the final arbiter of every Indian's fate, and India's constitution gives equal rights to every citizen. Muslim, Hindu, Christian, Sikh, Buddhist, everyone.
Y los líderes occidentales son muy cautelosos a la hora de hablar en público. En el diálogo de Raisina, Ursula von der Leyen se deshizo en elogios con la democracia india, sin mencionar las preocupaciones sobre las violaciones de los derechos humanos. Y aunque el ministro alemán competente sí habló de ello en las consultas intergubernamentales, también él fue muy cauteloso.
I'm not here in India to teach and preach, but if our advice is needed and is welcome, Germany is willing to help and to support.
Tras finalizar las consultas en Alemania, ni Olaf Scholz ni Narendra Modi mencionaron los derechos humanos en su comparecencia conjunta ante la prensa. Y a diferencia de lo que es habitual, no aceptaron ninguna pregunta por insistencia de la delegación india. Incluso el presidente estadounidense Joe Biden se muestra reacio a criticar abiertamente a Narendra Modi. Cuando se reunieron el año pasado, solo insinuó brevemente su opinión sobre lo que ocurre en la India.
As the world celebrates Mahatma Gandhi's birthday next week, we're all reminded that his message of non-violence, respect, tolerance matters today maybe more than it ever has.
Por supuesto que muchos de los países occidentales con colonizaciones criminales en su haber deben reflexionar sobre su historia antes de criticar a un país como la India. En un debate sobre los 75 años transcurridos desde la independencia de la India, el ministro indio de Exteriores lanzó un claro mensaje a Occidente. no nos dejaremos sermonear por ustedes.
Look, we have to be confident about who we are. I think it's better to engage the world on the basis of who we are rather than try and please the world as a pale imitation of what they are. This idea that others define us, that somewhere there we need to get approval of other quarters, I think that's an era we need to put behind us.
Jay Panda del partido Bharatiya Janata se hizo eco del mensaje.
The West needs to recognize that a strong, robust India and a secure India is not only in India's interest, not only in the West's interest, but also for the world, because this is the largest democracy that humankind has ever seen. Friends don't have to always agree with each other, but friends do have to have a core shared agreement, which I think we are gradually getting there. We are certainly cooperating much more with Western countries compared to just 2 decades ago.
Garima Mohan, del grupo de investigación German Marshall Fund, está a caballo entre la India y Europa. Afirma que si los europeos quieren reforzar la democracia india, deben centrarse en la sociedad civil.
Europe has a legacy problem with India because of the experience of colonialism. I think countries have to be very mindful of what leverage they have to influence change in a third country. What can outside actors do? I think it is important to keep faith in domestic actors and what they're doing, and asking how these actors in civil society or academia, intelligentsia, how they would like to be supported, if so. So I think Europe has these conversations. Many foundations, European foundations, work in India. They work with a lot of groups in India. And I think they're having those conversations. I think that is the best way to support this.
En cuanto a la asediada oposición del país, Shashi Tharoor rechaza las insinuaciones de que la democracia india está en peligro.
Well, as an opposition member of parliament who's allowed to function freely and who criticizes the government day in and day out in the public space, I will still say we are a democracy. Our elections are largely accepted as free and fair.
No obstante, sí asegura estar preocupado por las tendencias oficiales.
There have been more and more indications of autocracy. There have been a hollowing out of institutions of our state, which were formerly independent and whose independence was greatly prized, which have become much more overtly or covertly subordinate to the interests of the government or the ruling party. I think what we can say is, from having been a liberal democracy, we've become a much more illiberal one.
Desde su trabajo en un medio independiente, Hartosh Singhal tiene una visión más oscura de la realidad.
India is coming to resemble Russia and China far more than it resembles Western democracies. That the illusion that it is necessarily in that camp, given what is happening here, is not borne out by the facts on the ground here necessarily. So the West will have to deal with this country through very hard-nosed means rather than by thinking that this common shared value of constitutional democracy is going to pull India into our sphere. That is not true. India has no such desire. This regime in India does not represent any desire to emulate the idea of constitutional democracy. It is trying to subvert it.
Así que todo lo que se dice sobre la alianza de la India y Occidente en torno a los valores comunes para hacer frente a las autocracias, ¿es un mensaje creíble?
I think that is not the right framing for building a stronger relationship between Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Because if we go with certain standards, then a lot of countries in the Indo-Pacific will not fit to those standards of democracy and other issues that are being brought up. So I think one has to recognize the diversity of political systems that exist in the Indo-Pacific, and therefore I personally feel that this democracy versus authoritarian framing is not very useful because it will alienate more partners than it will win.
No hay duda de que a Occidente le gustaría que la India entrara de lleno en el club de las democracias liberales, pero como hemos visto, los distintos países no encajan a la perfección. Pero volvamos por un momento al punto de partida, al dilema geopolítico de la India entre una Rusia rebelde y la creciente amenaza de China. Aunque la India esté ante decisiones clave, también las potencias occidentales deben reflexionar, y algo de honestidad sería bienvenida en el intento, porque cuando se trata de poner límites a superpotencias sin escrúpulos, no hay tiempo que perder.